On the day I married one of the richest men in America, I wasn't crying tears of joy. I was begging my own mother not to make me do it. She looked me in the eye, she fixed my veil, and quietly she whispered, "You'll be fine. We can't lose everything over your selfishness." 3 years later, that same man would be in handcuffs. His family would be worth nothing. And my mother would be standing alone inside the empty company she sold me to save. But on that wedding day, I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that the man smiling beside me had already shown me exactly who he was. And no one was coming to save me. The woman who spoke those words is named Camille, and for a long time, she believed her story had ended on that altar. She was 29. She was beautiful in the way grief makes a person beautiful, all stillness and held breath. And she was being marched into a marriage that 300 guests mistook for a fairy tale. Not one of them asked the questions that mattered. Why would a mother trade her only daughter to a family she barely knew and call it a blessing? What had that quiet, ordinary young man done to be tossed aside like garbage? And how does a woman everyone agreed to pity end up holding the fate of 2 empires in her hands? They looked right at me and saw something they could spend, Camille says now. Every one of them. That was their mistake, not mine. To understand how a wedding became a reckoning, you have to go back to where it truly began. Long before the money, before the deal, before the man with the cruel hands, you have to go back to a teenager in an Atlanta high school who fell for a boy carrying a torn backpack and the best-kept secret in the country. Because the people in these stories spent their lives weighing everyone by the size of their bank account, and the one person they refused to weigh correctly was the one who would eventually strip them down to nothing. But before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. She was 16 when she met him, kneeling on a scuffed hallway floor, helping a stranger gather the books he'd dropped. His name was Elias. And when he looked up at her, embarrassed with a crooked half-smile, the noise of the whole school seemed to fall away. He drove a battered car with a passenger door that opened only from the outside. He wore the same gray sweatshirt more days than not. On weekends, he bagged screws and cut keys at a hardware store. And Camille fell for him the way you can only fall once in a life, before anyone has taught you to guard your own heart. He never tried to impress me, she remembers. People who have nothing to hide don't perform, and people who have everything to hide don't either. The first time I learned that lesson, it saved my life. They chose the same university. He buried himself in economics. She lived in the design studio until her hands were stained with ink. They were the couple everyone quietly bet on. One pair of earbuds between them. One plate of fries split down the middle, because that was the budget. He'd take her hand on the hood of that broken car and make promises that sounded impossible. One day, he'd tell her, "I'm going to build you a house with a window in every room. You'll never sit in the dark again." She'd laugh and ask him with what money. And he'd just smile and say, "Trust me." She always did. Trusting Elias was the easiest thing she ever did. It was the people who claimed to love her, who turned love into a weapon. And the first of those people wore her mother's face. Gloria Brooks met Elias twice before she rendered her verdict. And she delivered it the way she delivered everything. Cold, certain, and designed to wound. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She looked the boy up and down in her own foyer and said it to his face. "I'll be honest with you, since no one else will. You're a charity case my daughter picked up. And I don't keep charity in this family. Then she sent him home and turned on Camille. "Do you know what people will say if you bring that into my house? That I raised a daughter with no standards. I did not climb out of nothing. To watch you crawl back into it, holding hands with a stock boy. He makes me happy," Camille said, and her mother laughed, a short, contemptuous sound. "Happy," Gloria repeated, like the word disgusted her. "Happy doesn't pay for anything. And it certainly won't pay my creditors. Grow up, Camille." She could not have known, sneering across her marble foyer, that she had just set in motion the costliest miscalculation of her life. She looked at her daughter's boyfriend and saw a stock boy, a dead end, a thing to be discarded. But what she could not see, what no one in this story would see until the damage was permanent, was the truth Elias had spent years hiding beneath. that gray sweatshirt. He was not poor. He was the heir to a fortune that could have bought and sold Gloria Brooks 100 times over. And the thing he was hiding would one day burn her empire to the ground. Gloria Brooks did not become cruel by accident, and she did not deserve anyone's pity for it. She grew up poor. She watched her own family lose their home, the furniture carried out onto the sidewalk, while the neighbors pretended not to look. And in that moment, a young Gloria made two decisions that would define the rest of her life. The first was that she would claw her way to wealth, no matter what it cost. The second, and this was the one that mattered most, was that human beings were only ever worth what they could pay. She took a single run-down duplex, rebuilt it with her own two hands, and grew it into Brooks Development Group. Her name bolted onto buildings all across Atlanta, and the higher she climbed, the more openly she treated people as line items, staff she fired on a whim, friends she dropped the moment they stopped being useful, and a daughter she raised to be an asset, not a child. People want me to say she had a soft side, Camille says, and her voice goes flat and certain here. She didn't. She had a public side, for the cameras, for the galas, and then she had the real one, and the real one looked at me like a stock that hadn't matured yet. I spent my whole childhood trying to earn a warmth that was never coming. Every relationship Gloria had was a transaction, and the only feeling she ever truly trusted was fear. So when Brooks Development began to drown, when the flagship project collapsed, when the loans came due, when the same bankers who once flattered her at dinners started calling to read deadlines like prison sentences, she did not feel shame for the choices that brought her there. She did not feel worth for the hundreds of employees who depended on her. She felt only one thing. She needed someone to sell. Camille saw the trouble long before her mother would admit it. She'd come home late and find Gloria at the kitchen table near dawn, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, glaring at columns of red ink, as though she could frighten the numbers into changing. One of those nights, Camille pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "Let me help, Mama," she said softly. "Whatever this is, let me help you carry it." Gloria didn't even look up from the papers. "You want to help?" she said. Make yourself valuable for once." Camille thought it was just her mother's usual coldness, a tired woman lashing out. Hold on to that, because she had no idea it was a plan already taking shape. Because the people about to walk into their lives were exactly the kind of people Gloria Brooks respected. Rich, ruthless, and without a single conscience between them. They were the Sterlings. Old money, so old that no one could even say how the first dollar was made. Only that there was now an obscene amount of it. And as fate would have it, the Sterlings owned the very bank that owned Gloria's debt. The family that could crush her with one phone call was the same family that could save her. But the Sterlings had a problem of their own. And his name was Preston, their only son, mid-40s, a man who had never once in his life met a consequence head-on. He had burned through every relationship, every second chance, every quiet check his parents wrote to make his messes disappear. He came home before dawn with empty eyes, smelling of things the family refused to name out loud, and every woman who had ever come near him took one look and fled. But Richard and Margaret Sterling didn't want their son fixed. They wanted him covered. They wanted a wife to make him presentable, a baby to secure the bloodline, a respectable photograph for the wall, proof to the world that the Sterling name was still pristine. What they needed was a woman desperate enough to be bought, and a mother greedy enough to sell her. They were about to find both in the same house. At a gala, weeks before any of it began, a woman who had once worked inside the Sterling home moved close to Camille in the crowd. She gripped her arm tight, urgent, and breathed 6 words into her ear. Whatever they offer you, just run.
Just run.
Then she was gone, swallowed by the party, before Camille could even ask her name. Camille still hears that voice to this day. "I should have run," she says quietly. "I had the warning. I heard it with my own ears. I just didn't have anyone in my corner brave enough to make me believe it. Not yet. No one ever calls it selling. The rich call it a partnership, an opportunity, a merger of great houses, and they pour it over champagne, until even the seller can pretend it's something noble." By the time the company's troubles had quietly grown into a crisis, Camille was no longer a college girl with ink-stained hands. She was a grown woman in her late 20s, still in love with the same man, still believing her life was her own. She learned of the arrangement the evening her mother came home glowing, not with love, but with the cold relief of a woman who had finally found a buyer. "Sit down," Gloria said. "I've fixed everything. The Sterlings are going to absorb the debt and save this company, save everything I built." Camille felt that flicker of foolish hope and asked how, and her mother smiled, the same way she smiled at closings. "A union between the families. You'll marry Preston Sterling. He's
You'll
wealthy.
marry Preston Sterling.
He's connected.
He's more than a
and
girl
frankly,
in your position should
he's more than a
expect.
girl in your position should expect." The living room seemed to tilt beneath her. "A union?" Camille repeated, the word turning to frost in her mouth. "Mama, I'm with Elias. You know I'm with Elias." Every trace of warmth left her mother's face. "I told that stock boy to his face that he was a charity case," Gloria said. "And I meant every word. You will end it tonight, and you will marry a man who can actually do something for this family. This is not a discussion." When Camille refused, her mother did not soften. She sharpened. "Let me explain what selfish looks like," Gloria said. Selfish is a grown woman, so obsessed with her own little feelings that she lets her mother lose everything. The house, the company, the hundreds of people on my payroll, all so she can keep playing house with a boy who bags screws for a living. Is that the woman you want to be? Selfish. That word became Gloria's blade. And she drove it in again and again, every single time Camille reached for her own life, until the girl finally went silent, and underneath the word, there were threats. Gloria reminded her daughter exactly who held the family's money, the lease on her apartment, the future she had dangled, and could just as easily take back, worn down, cornered, made to believe she was the only thing standing between her family and complete ruin. Camille did the thing she would mourn for the rest of her life. She called Elias, and because she could not bear to confess the truth, that she was being handed over like collateral, sold to settle her mother's debt, she let him believe the kinder, crueler lie. She let him think she'd chosen the money. She let him think she'd looked at his broken car and simply decided he wasn't enough. He didn't shout. That was the unbearable part. "Camille," he said, and his voice was so steady it broke her in half. Just tell me you don't love me. Say those exact words, and I'll go. I won't fight you. I won't call. I'll just disappear." She opened her mouth. The words wouldn't come, so she said nothing, and she let the silence do the cruelest thing a silence can do. "I had one mercy left to give him," she says now, and her composure slips here every time. "A clean goodbye, that's all. And I was too broken to even give him that. I just hung up the phone, and I cried on that floor until I couldn't breathe." By morning, Elias was gone, out of the city, out of the country, gone. And it would be 3 long years before Camille understood the true size of what her mother had made her throw away. You already know how the wedding opened, because Camille opened the story with it herself. The veil, the mirror, the whisper. What she left out is everything that came before she reached that aisle. She stood in the bridal suite, in a gown that cost more than the home she was raised in, staring at a stranger in the mirror, while her mother circled her, filling the silence the way people do when they're afraid of it. "You're finally going to be worth something," Gloria said, and she meant it, as encouragement. Camille met her mother's reflected eyes and gave her the last piece of truth she had left. "I don't want to be worth something, Mama. I want to choose." Gloria didn't even pause. She smoothed the veil and she said, "We can't lose everything over your selfishness." And she turned for the door without another glance. So Camille walked toward a man she had met only 4 times, past 300 faces, all convinced they were watching love. She was trembling so hard beneath that gown that the bouquet shook in her hands. Preston smiled at her with rehearsed tenderness, and only she was close enough to see that the smile never reached his eyes. The Sterlings watched from the front row, with the quiet satisfaction of people whose acquisition had finally cleared. And as reached the altar, Camille caught her mother's face in the crowd, and Gloria was weeping. "People love to tell me that a mother's tears mean she secretly cared," Camille says. "They didn't. She wasn't crying because she'd lost me. She was crying because she'd won. Those were the same tears she cried when a big deal closed. I just never thought I'd be the deal." She signed her name as a Sterling that afternoon, and by the following Monday, she understood she had not been married at all. She had been delivered, signed for, accepted, and shelved inside a house built to forget her. The very first night, Preston made the arrangement plain. He poured himself a drink. He looked her over like inventory, and he said, "Let's be clear about what this is. My family needs an heir and a pretty face at the table. You needed saving, so you'll smile when we have company. You'll give me a child, and you'll keep your opinions to yourself." Then his voice dropped, soft and almost pleasant, which was somehow worse than shouting. "And don't ever embarrass me. You won't like me when I'm embarrassed." He finished his drink, and he walked out, leaving her alone, in a room, in a house with 40 of them, none of them hers. She survived that house the way people survive hostile country, by learning its signals. In the beginning, she had tried to make a home of it. She rearranged flowers no one noticed. She learned the names of staff who were not allowed to learn hers. She set a beautiful table for a husband who might not come home for 2 days, and might come home in a fury when he did. And slowly, she stopped trying to live in that house. She started trying to survive it. She could tell which version of her husband had walked through the door, from the sound of his keys hitting the marble. Slow and even, and she could breathe. Quick fumbling dropped twice, and she knew the night had already turned. She learned to read his face, too. The way his jaw would set, the way his voice would go quiet and precise, the way his eyes flattened into something that no longer saw a person standing in front of him. "I could feel it coming, the way animals feel a storm," she says. "My whole body would go cold. I'd start apologizing before he'd even said a word, for things I hadn't done, just hoping I could talk him down. Most nights I couldn't. It always began with words. That is how it begins with men like Preston. They break you down with the mouth, long before anything else."
"You're nothing.
You're nothing," he'd tell her, circling her slowly. "You'd be in a gutter if my family hadn't bought you. Your own mother haggled over the price. Did you know that?" She wanted more. "That's what you're worth, Camille. That's all you've ever been worth." Some nights it was her face he went after. "Look at you. You think any of these people respect you? They tolerate you, because I tell them to." Other nights it was the marriage itself. "I could have married anyone, and I got handed you." He'd back her into corners with that flat, quiet voice, and watch the fear climb her face, enjoying it. That was the part she could never make anyone understand, that the cruelty wasn't hot. It was cold, patient. He liked the fear more than the fight, and what happened after the words, Camille has never described in full, and she will not be made to hear. People always want the details, she says quietly. They don't need them. If you've ever flinched at the sound of a key in a lock, then you already know everything I'm not going to say. The first time, she told herself it was an accident. The second time, she blamed the drinking. By the third, she had stopped explaining it at all. She had simply become an expert at covering what showed. The faint marks she learned to hide, beneath long sleeves and a careful layer of makeup. The mornings she angled her face away from the housekeepers and away from the light. How to steady her hands before she lifted a coffee cup. How to smile at Margaret Sterling across that endless dinner table. As though nothing in the world were wrong, she got so good at it that the world saw a glowing billionaire's wife, and never once saw the woman underneath, counting the hours until the next storm. And the staff, there were always staff drifting through those 40 rooms, learned to keep their eyes on the floor. A whole household of people who saw and decided their paychecks were worth more than she was. His parents were no better. They were only colder about it. When Margaret found her crying once in a corridor she thought was empty, the older woman felt nothing at all. "Pull yourself together," Margaret said. "You've been given a name most people in this country would kill for. Whatever happens behind closed doors, you keep it behind closed doors. You do not embarrass this family. Now fix your face and come down to dinner. Act grateful." And that was the moment Camille understood the full shape of the trap. There was no rescue coming from that family. They hadn't brought her in to love her. They had bought her to manage Preston, to absorb him, to be the soft thing that broke so the Sterling name never had to. And then came the part of this story that nearly ended her. Twice, in those years, Camille carried a child. Twice she let herself hope. She'd press a hand to her stomach in the dark and make promises that she'd find a way out, that she'd get them both somewhere safe, that this tiny life would be the reason she finally found her courage. And twice, after the worst of his nights, that hope did not survive what she was living inside. She lost them, in that house, in ways she has never spoken aloud and never will. There are no words being put to it here, because some griefs do not belong to an audience. What can be said is what it did to her. I used to lie on the bathroom floor and whisper to them, she says, and this is where her voice finally breaks completely. I'd say, I'm so sorry, I'm your mother and I couldn't protect you. I couldn't even keep you safe inside my own body, because I couldn't keep myself safe in that house. I have never forgiven myself for that, and I'm not sure I ever will. After the second loss, something in Camille went out, like a light. What followed had a name, even if she couldn't say it out loud back then. It was depression, the real kind, the kind that has weight, the kind you cannot simply decide your way out of. She fell into it so deep, she could not find the bottom. There were mornings she could not lift herself from the bed. Days the food on her tray went cold and untouched. Nights she lay awake in the dark, counting footsteps in the hall, terrified of which ones would stop at her door. She stopped recognizing the woman in the mirror, the bright girl with the ink-stained hands, the one who used to split a plate of fries and laugh until she cried. That girl was gone, and Camille could not remember where she'd left her. I disappeared inside myself, she says. I wasn't living anymore, I was just waiting to see how it ended. And in that lowest place, with nothing left, and no one near, she did the only thing she had ever been taught to do when she was drowning. She went to her mother. She drove across the city with her hands shaking on the wheel. She sat down in her mother's living room, that beautiful, expensive room she'd grown up being told to be grateful for, and she told Gloria the truth, all of it, that her husband hurt her, that she had lost her babies, that she was frightened. For her life, she begged. Please, Mama, just let me come home. I can't do it anymore. I think he's going to kill me. And her mother, looking at her broken, grieving, terrified daughter, chose the company. You'll be fine, Gloria said, smoothing her own sleeve.
It is better to cry
It is better to cry in a mansion
we can't lose everything
than to cry in a gutter. Every marriage has its troubles, Camille. Camille stared at her. He hurt me, Mama. I lost my children, and Gloria did not even flinch. And have you ever stopped to think that you might be the reason he loses his temper? Fix your character. Stop crying. Stop playing the pity card. And make that man happy for once. The decision I made for you is the best decision any mother could make for her child. We can't lose everything over your selfishness. Camille pulled her hands back slowly off the arm of her mother's expensive sofa, and she searched that face, the face that used to read her bedtime stories, for a single trace of love, and she found a stranger, doing arithmetic. I drove myself home that night, Camille says, her voice gone flat and far away, back to the place that was killing me, back to the babies I'd lost there. Because the woman who was supposed to stand between me and the whole world had just told me it was my fault, that my life was a fair price for her business. That was the night I stopped crying altogether, not because it stopped hurting, God, no, but because I had finally understood that no one was coming. Not my husband, not his family, not even my own mother. No one. Something in me went silent then. Like a phone, the second before the screen goes black. She believed that silence was the end of her. She had no idea that it was the last thing that had to die, before she could finally fight back. And she would have stayed lost in that silence forever, if it hadn't been for one person who simply refused to let her disappear. A woman named Nia. Plenty of women never climb out of that silence. The world would have filed Camille away as one more delicate heiress who simply came apart. A sad footnote. A beautiful woman who had everything and somehow still fell to pieces. That is the story the Sterlings were ready to tell about her. That is the story her own mother had already half believed. But there was one person who refused to read that ending. Her name was Nia. They had been inseparable since they were 19 years old, back when Camille still laughed with her whole body, back before any of this. Nia was loud where Camille was soft, blunt where Camille was careful, and she had distrusted the Sterlings from the very first wedding photograph, the way you distrust a smile that goes on a half-second too long. For 2 years, that family had worked to cut Camille off from the world. Her calls were watched, her visits were managed, her old friends were quietly pruned away, one by one, until her whole life fit inside 40 cold rooms. But you do not prune away a woman like Nia. She kept showing up. Birthday lunches no one invited her to. Coffee left at the gatehouse with a note that said she was just in the neighborhood. A voicemail every Sunday, whether Camille answered or not. She was a splinter the Sterlings could never quite work out of the skin, and thank God for that. Then one afternoon, she finally got through. She cornered Camille in the back booth of a quiet restaurant, far from the estate, where no Sterling driver could see and no Sterling ear could hear, and she really looked at her friend. The heavy makeup that didn't quite sit right, the long sleeves in the middle of summer, the weight that had melted off her frame, the eyes that had gone somewhere far away, and Nia's whole face changed. "Camille," she said very low, "look at me. What is he doing to you?" Camille reached for the line she gave everyone. The one she'd perfected. "I'm fine, really. Things have just been don't." Nia's hand shot across the table and closed over hers, hard, refusing to let go. "Don't you dare lie to me. Not me. I have known you since we were kids, and I am sitting here, watching you disappear right in front of my eyes. Your mother handed you to these people. You've buried things in that house no woman should ever have to bury. And now you're covering for them too." Camille's chin trembled. "I won't let you do this," Nia said. "Do you hear me? Not you." And that the fierceness of it, the refusal, was the thing that finally cracked her open. Camille folded forward over that little restaurant table, and she wept, really wept, for the first time in front of another living soul, for the husband, for the babies, for the mother who'd sent her back, for the years she'd lost being someone's punching bag and someone's payment. Nia didn't hush her. She didn't tell her it would be okay. She just held her hand through all of it, and waited until the worst of it had passed. And then she said the thing that, to this day, Camille calls the moment her life turned. "Why are you this fragile?" Nia asked, and there were tears standing in her own eyes as she said it, but her voice did not shake. "This is not the girl I grew up with. The Camille I know would have burned this whole thing to the ground a year ago, and danced in the ashes. They have spent 3 years convincing you that you're nothing, and you believed them. So you are going to stop disappearing, and you are going to start fighting back. Because if you won't fight for yourself," she squeezed her hand, "then I swear on everything, I will do it for you." Something fractured open in Camille that afternoon, not all at once, just a hairline, a single thread of light, slipping under a door that had been sealed shut for 3 long years. "I don't have anything," Camille whispered. "I don't have money, I don't have power, he controls all of it. I have nothing left, Nia." Nia leaned in close until their foreheads nearly touched. "You have him," she said quietly. "You still have Elias." And Camille pulled back, shaking her head, the old grief rushing up all over again. "Elias is gone. He left the country years ago. He thinks I chose the money over him. He thinks I looked at him and decided he wasn't enough. He would never want to hear my name again." And that is when Nia told her the secret she had been carrying for 3 whole years. She had never lost touch with him, not once. Through every move, every silence, every continent, she had kept his number. A message here, a reply there. A quiet thread between 2 people who both still loved the same broken girl, and never said so out loud. Camille stared at her, the room tilting. "Let me tell him the truth," Nia said. "Let me tell him what your mother really did, what that house has really been. Let me tell him that you never chose this." For a long moment, Camille couldn't speak, because saying yes meant admitting all of it. It meant Elias would finally know what had been done to her. It meant he would know she had never, for one single day, stopped loving him. And some ruined part of her, the part the Sterlings had built so carefully, still believed she did not deserve to be saved. But she was so tired. So slowly, she nodded. And that night, on the other side of the world, a quiet man's phone lit up in the dark. A message from an old number he had never been able to delete, and it began with 4 words. She didn't choose this. Camille had no idea what she had just set in motion. She had no idea that the boy she'd mourned for 3 years was about to walk back into her life, and she had absolutely no idea who he had been the entire time. 11 days, that is all it took, for him to come back. Camille found out the way she found out everything in that house, through a wall, by overhearing. Preston was pacing his study with the phone pressed to his ears, and his voice carried something she had never heard from him before. Not anger, something underneath anger. Fear. "What do you mean a Hawthorne is buying?" he snapped. "I don't care what it costs. We do not sell to a Hawthorne, not 1 share, not 1 square foot." A pause, and then lower, almost shaken. "How is he even back in the country?" Camille stood frozen in the corridor, one hand against the cool wall, and felt the floor of her certainty crack. Hawthorne. She knew that name the way the whole country knew that name. The Hawthornes weren't billionaires the way the Sterlings were billionaires. They were the family that billionaires lowered their voices around. Older, larger, global. And this was the part that turned the air to ice. They were the Sterlings' oldest enemy, a feud 2 generations deep. She didn't yet understand why her husband had gone so pale at a single surname. She would understand the very next day. When she slipped out, under the cover of a charity luncheon, Nia had arranged a meeting. A contact, she'd said. Someone who could help. She gave Camille only an address and a time. And when the car finally stopped, Camille looked up at the building and felt her breath catch. She knew this place. Everyone knew this place. It was Hawthorne Tower, the crown of the family's empire. And the floor she'd been sent to, the private penthouse at its very top, was the most exclusive address in the country. The kind of place that lived on television and in magazines, spoken about in hushed tones. Only one bloodline on earth was ever allowed through those doors. No one reached the Hawthornes without immense power and connection, and even then, almost never, the Hawthornes. Camille stepped out of the elevator, certain there had been a mistake. Her heart was pounding. Why would Nia send me here? What could a contact of hers possibly be doing? In the one place no one but a Hawthorne is allowed to stand. And then she saw him, a man at the floor-to-ceiling windows. He stood tall, his back to her, the whole glittering city spread out below him, like something he owned. "Hello?" she said, her voice unsteady. I think I'm in the wrong." He turned, and the years fell away and crashed down on her in the very same instant. Elias, she breathed. But even as she said it, her mind was racing, refusing to fit the pieces together. The simple clothes were gone. The broken car was a memory. He wore a suit so quietly, flawlessly expensive that even after 3 years among the Sterlings, she could tell it outclassed anything Preston had ever owned. And he was standing, in the one room on earth reserved for the most powerful family alive, the Hawthornes. The same name her husband had whispered the night before, in fear. Elias. Her hand found the door frame to hold herself up. "What are you doing here? Do you understand where this is? This floor, this whole building, it belongs to the Hawthornes. Only the Hawthornes. My husband was terrified of that name last night. He said their son was back from abroad. And you're just standing here, like you." The sentence collapsed in her throat, because a thought had begun to rise, slow, impossible, terrifying, and she could not make herself say it out loud. He crossed half the room and then stopped, as if afraid of frightening her. "Say it," she whispered. "Whatever it is, just say it." He drew a slow breath, and then the boy her mother had called a charity case, to his face, spoke the words that detonated everything Camille thought she knew. "My name was never just Elias," he said quietly. "To the whole world. I was Reed, my mother's name. I've carried it my entire life. You are the only person I ever gave the rest of it to. The only one I ever let call me Elias." He held her eyes. "My real name is Elias Reed Hawthorne, their son, the only heir to the Hawthorne fortune. The one your husband is so afraid of." The room went perfectly still, and then, quietly, he told her the truth he had carried since before they ever met. He was the only son of one of the most powerful families on earth, and being the only son came with a cage. His father, a formidable, controlling man, the kind people feared long before they met him, had decided Elias's whole life in advance. He would marry early, he would produce heirs, he would carry the dynasty forward, because there was no one else to carry it. "My father loved my mother too much to ever take a second wife," Elias said, even when she could no longer give him more children, so all of it fell on me, the whole weight of the name. He didn't want my happiness, he wanted my obedience. But it wasn't only the pressure that drove him into hiding. It was what the name did to people. Every woman who ever found out who I was changed, he said. Their eyes would light up, but never for me, for the fortune, for the face. Never the man underneath. And the ones who didn't want my money were terrified of my father. People knew what he could do to anyone who crossed this family. So they kept their distance, or they performed. I could never tell what was real. So he made a choice his father never forgave. He stepped out of the gilded world and went looking for an ordinary one. He'd done it even as a boy, slipping away from the cars and the guards to walk among people who had no idea who he was. And by the time he reached university, he made it a life. He chose a school far beneath the ones his name demanded. He answered to his mother's name, the person he loved most in the world. He drove a broken car. He worked a register on weekends. Wealthy and watched at home, ordinary and free out in the world. My father was furious, Elias said. He'd ask me, "Do you have any idea the power you're throwing away?" But I didn't want power. I wanted one corner of my life that was mine. One place where someone might love me without knowing the price tag. And then in a scuffed hallway, on the floor, gathering somebody's dropped books, he found her. Camille sank into a chair because her knees would no longer hold her. All those nights splitting a single plate of fries. The house with a window in every room. Trust me, he could have built her 1,000 of those houses and never felt the cost. "My mother called you a charity case," she said, the irony cutting deeper than anything Gloria had ever done to her. "She sold me to the Sterlings to save the company, and you," her voice broke. "You could have saved all of it with one phone call." "I know," Elias said, and for the first time, she saw something in his beautiful face that was not gentle at all. "When you went silent on me, I believed it," he said. "I believed you'd chosen the money. It nearly destroyed me. So I went home. I let my father win. And the family that has been waiting 2 generations to bury the Sterlings welcomed their son back with open arms." He didn't say it for sympathy. He said it because he was about to tell her what came next. "And the family she sold you to," he said quietly, "are the one family on this earth that mine has been waiting 2 generations to bury." He crossed to her. He knelt down in front of her chair. And he took the hands she had spent 3 years learning to hide. "You've been living inside my enemy's house," he said, "which means you know things no outsider ever could.
You were never powerless.
You were never powerless, Camille.
You are standing in the most dangerous position ever allowed.
You are standing in the most dangerous position the Sterlings have ever allowed anyone to stand in." And for the first time in 3 years, the silence inside her broke. "I stopped feeling like a victim that day," she says. "I felt like a key. Here is what the Sterlings never grasped about the woman they had installed in their home. They had spent 3 years teaching her to be invisible, to stay quiet, to hover at the edges of every room, to be noticed, as little as a person can possibly be. They had trained her with great patience in the art of disappearing. What they never imagined was that one day she would take that training and turn it into a weapon and aim it directly back at them. It began in that penthouse the day everything changed. Before anything else, Elias laid down one condition. He held both of her hands, and he said it plainly. "If this ever becomes too much," he told her, "you walk away. We find another road. You are worth more to me than every share that family owns. Do you understand me?" But Camille was done looking for another road. "I didn't want to be rescued anymore," she says. "I'd had enough of waiting for someone to come and save me. My husband never would. His family never would. And my own mother looked me in the eye and chose her company over my life. So no, I didn't want to rescue. I wanted to do it myself. I wanted them to know, one day, that the woman they treated like a piece of furniture was the one who ended them. But to understand why the Hawthorns were so willing to help her bury the Sterlings, you have to understand what the Sterlings had once done to them. 2 generations earlier, the 2 families had not been enemies. They had been partners. Back then, the Sterlings were bankers, old, powerful money, built on finance, lending, and the property that money could buy. And the Hawthorns were builders and investors, with their hands in everything that pointed toward the future. Together, they had joined forces on one enormous venture, a sweeping deal to fund and build an empire of land, towers, an industry that would have belonged to both families for 100 years, sealed with a handshake and a signature. And then the Sterlings betrayed it. It was a betrayal of pure business, cold, calculated, and ruthless. With the deal half built, and the Hawthorns trusting their partners completely, the Sterlings moved in the dark. They broke every promise they had made, seized the venture for themselves, and left the Hawthorns holding the ruin of it. And when the dust finally settled, it had not only cost the Hawthorns a fortune, it had cost lives, good people, ruined and lost in the wreckage of what the Sterlings did to win. It nearly destroyed the Hawthorn name entirely. The family came within a breath of crumbling into nothing, but one man refused to let it fall. Elias's father, the formidable, controlling man who would one day cage his only son. Whatever else he was a fighter. He clawed the Hawthorns back from the edge with his bare hands. He rebuilt everything they had lost. And then he built it higher than the Sterlings could ever dream of reaching, until the Hawthorns stood, to this very day, as the single most powerful family in the country. But he never forgave, and he never forgot. And in case you're wondering why these two families, both worth more than entire nations, feel like they belong to completely different worlds, here is the difference. The Sterlings are old money, the oldest kind. Their power was inherited, passed down through generations who never had to build a thing. So they cling to the past, to grand stone mansions, ancestor portraits in gold frames, antique halls, and heirlooms older than the country itself. To them, the name is everything. They don't prove their wealth. They simply expect you to already know it. The Hawthorns are something else entirely. Their fortune may be just as old, but a generation ago it was nearly destroyed. Elias's father didn't inherit a throne. He rebuilt one from the ashes with his bare hands. And so the Hawthorns don't live in the past. They own the future. Glass towers that scrape the clouds. Modern empires built of steel and light. Where the Sterlings whisper about their history, the Hawthorns simply build something taller. Both families could buy anything in the world, but only one of them was still rising. 2 generations, waiting, watching, for the moment the Sterlings would finally be vulnerable. And now, that moment had walked through the door, wearing a wedding ring she never wanted. So Camille went back into that house, and she began to play the longest, most dangerous game of her life. In public, she became the flawless Sterling wife, the very thing they had tried to mold her into. She smiled at the dinners. She hosted the galas. She wore the jewelry and the gowns, and she let the world keep believing the fairy tale. But underneath that perfect surface, she had finally come alive. She stood quietly at the edges of rooms full of powerful men who had long since forgotten she could even hear them. Men who said things in front of her they would never have said in front of an equal, because to them she wasn't one, and she listened to every word. Piece by piece, the truth of the Sterling Empire began to take shape in front of her. Preston's recklessness, she realized, wasn't only personal, it was financial, and it ran far deeper than anyone outside that family knew. Transactions that didn't reconcile. Money moving in directions money had no business moving. Debts and liabilities buried so far down that the family's own board of directors knew nothing about them. I want to be very clear about something, Camille says, and her voice is steady here. I never stole a thing, not one document. Because I knew, the moment I broke the law, I'd become just like them. So I didn't. I photographed what was already lying out in the open. I remembered conversations word for word. I noticed which lawyer arrived on which night and which door he used. And slowly, piece by piece, I built a map. In the Notes app of a second phone, a cheap one the family had no idea existed. She rebuilt the entire architecture of everything the Sterlings had hidden, every secret, every lie, every buried account, and every few days, in stolen minutes, a missed call returned, a quiet moment behind a locked door. She handed that map to Elias, and the Hawthorns did the rest. They didn't kick the door down. The Hawthorns never kick a door down. They simply buy the building the door is attached to. And here is the part the Sterlings never saw coming. They never bought a single thing from the Sterlings directly. Preston had sworn they never would, and he was right. They didn't have to. Instead, they bought the debt the Sterlings owed to everyone else. They bought shares from every hand that would quietly sell, through names that could never be traced back. The loans, the suppliers, the leverage. The Sterlings never sold so much as a paperclip to a Hawthorn. They simply woke up one morning and found they were already owned by one. But the thing that would truly end them, Camille had not found yet. She found it on an ordinary night. For months, she had quietly watched her husband at his desk, watched the way his fingers moved across the keys of his laptop, the same pattern, night after night, until she knew his password by heart without ever once being told it. And one evening, while the house was empty and Preston was gone, she sat down in his study, and she opened it. She told herself she was looking for more of the same. More numbers, more hidden accounts, more of the map. What she found instead was a video. I'm not going to describe it, Camille says, and her voice drops to almost nothing. I won't. I've spent years trying to unsee it. All I'll tell you is that I had to put my hand over my own mouth in that empty house to keep from screaming. It was Preston and a woman, a young woman, somewhere in her 30s. And by the end of it, that woman was not moving. Camille's hands were shaking so badly she could barely close the laptop because she knew that face. She had seen it before, years ago, before she was ever married into that family. On the news, in the papers, a bright, well-known young woman from a powerful family of their own, who had simply vanished one night and was never found. The world had been told she'd run off, that she lived recklessly, that she'd most likely come to harm by her own hand somewhere far away. The world had been lied to, and Camille was now the only person outside that family who knew the truth. That was the moment I stopped being afraid of dying in that house, she says quietly, because I finally understood if I didn't get this out, he would simply do it again, to me. And the world would believe him the same way they'd believed him about her. She did not go to the police, not yet. The Sterlings owned half the people who would have taken that report. She went to the one family on earth powerful enough and patient enough to make it count. She made one copy, and she put it into Elias's hands. She had no idea, in that moment, that she was holding the final blow. The one piece of truth that would turn a slow, quiet ruin into the total destruction of a dynasty. For a while, the Sterlings did not even know they were falling. The Hawthorns already owned the debt. They already owned the shares, bought in silence and through names as no one could trace, from every hand that would quietly sell. The trap had been built all around the family, while they slept soundly inside it. And then, one piece at a time, it began to close. It started with a tremor. Sterling Group stock, which the family had always treated as a law of nature, dipped, just slightly. Enough to make a few careful people frown, and then came the first cut, not a financial one, a whisper, a short item buried in an evening news broadcast. A woman's death, years old, that investigators were now quietly re-examining. And then the line that turned the air in every boardroom cold, that something recovered in the case, something tied to that night, pointed toward the Sterlings. It was not confirmed. It was barely more than a suggestion, but it had the Sterling name attached to it. And that was enough. It was Elias, reaching into the dark, pulling a single thread, and letting the Sterlings feel it move. He didn't drop the whole truth at once. Camille says that wasn't his way. He let them bleed slowly. He wanted them to feel it coming, the way I used to feel Preston coming, by the sound of his keys. He wanted them to live in the dread before the fall, and it worked. Quietly, the world began to lean away from the Sterlings. Invitations cooled. Calls went unreturned. The careful, powerful people who had always orbited that name started keeping their distance, just in case. Because in their world, you do not wait for proof. The moment a name turns dangerous, you are already gone. The Sterlings were bleeding, and they still didn't know who had cut them, until a man who worked under Preston, someone who had spent years learning where the bodies of the business were buried, brought him a name, the secret buyer, the fund swallowing their shares, the hand behind every untraceable purchase, Hawthorne. Preston went very still when he heard it, because in that single word, every slipping deal, every quiet loss suddenly had a face, an old enemy, a two-generation wound, and a question he could not yet answer. Why now? He would get his chance to ask. It came at a gathering of the great houses, one of those rare evenings when the most powerful families in the country share the same air, smiling over champagne they'd happily poison each other with. And there, across a marble room, Preston saw him, Elias Hawthorne. He crossed the floor and pulled him into a private corner, his voice low and shaking with fury. "Hawthorne," he hissed, "this is you, every bit of it.
Every bit of it.
Is
you
this
think you can tear my family apart?
Some little revenge?
The Sterlings do not break.
You think you can buy your way into my family and tear it apart? Let me tell you something. No matter how high you Hawthorns sit, the Sterlings have power you have never even seen. We do not break." And Elias simply looked at him. Calm, unhurried, the hazel green eyes steady, the look of a man who had waited a very long time and could afford to wait a little longer. "This," Elias said quietly, "this is the tip of the iceberg. You haven't seen the real show yet, Preston.
You cross something that belongs
You
to me.
cross something that belonged to me. And men who take what belongs to a Hawthorne, they don't get to keep their kingdoms." Preston's jaw tightened. "What are you talking about? What did I ever take from? For 3 generations, Elias went on, ignoring him, his voice never rising. We have waited, and tonight, you walked your whole family right into our arms. So let me give you the only warning you'll ever get. He leaned in, close. The hawthorn bite takes the flesh from the bone, and by the time you feel our teeth, it's already too late to run. He never said Camille's name. He didn't have to. He turned and walked away and left Preston standing in that corner, with the first true taste of fear he had ever known. That same week, the war reached the fathers, Richard Sterling. Silver-haired, old money, a man who had crushed lesser families his whole life, picked up the phone and called the one man left who could still answer him as an equal, the Hawthorne patriarch, Elias's father, a powerful, formidable man in the full force of his prime, the man who had once dragged his entire dynasty back from the edge of ruin with his bare hands and built it higher than anyone alive. It's been a long time, Richard said, forcing his voice steady. It has, the Hawthorne patriarch answered, cold even. Not long enough. Richard tried the language of titans, old respect, shared history, a suggestion, between powerful men, that perhaps this had all gone far enough, that their families had bled each other once before, and surely neither wanted to do it again, and the Hawthorne patriarch let him finish. And then he spoke, and every word landed like a stone dropped down a well. You speak to me of enough, he said. Do you remember what your father called enough, Richard? When he broke our handshake and tried to bury my family in the dirt. When good men died so that the Sterlings could win. I rebuilt everything you took. I built it higher than your name will ever climb again. And I made myself one promise in the worst of those years. A pause. That one day, the Sterlings would taste betrayal from the other side. Your son just served me that day on a silver plate, wrapped and tied and delivered to my door. Richard's hand tightened on the phone. You should be afraid, the patriarch finished softly. Not of how much I'll do, of how little I have to do now, to watch you fall. The line went dead, and for the first time in his life, Richard Sterling was truly deeply afraid. And while the Sterling men raged at each other, Margaret Sterling went to work the only way she knew how. The matriarch, who had once looked at a grieving, broken Camille and told her to fix her face and act grateful, now sat at her writing desk and made call after call to the old families, the society names, the powerful friends she had spent 40 years collecting like jewelry. She called in every favor the Sterling name had ever earned, and one by one, they let her go to voicemail. The invitations stopped. The lunches were rescheduled. The women who had once begged for a seat at her table suddenly could not remember her number. Margaret Sterling had spent her whole life believing the name made her untouchable. She was about to learn it had only ever made her useful. Richard turned that fear on his son. When the two men finally stood face to face in the Sterling study, 3 generations of Sterling pride crumbling around them, Richard did something he had never done in 40 years. He struck him. One hard, open-handed blow across Preston's face, the sound of it cracking through that cold marble room. What did you do? Richard roared, his composure finally gone. What did you do that was so vile the Hawthorns crawled out of 2 generations of silence to come for us? Every door is closing. Every friend is running. There is blood in the water and they smell it. What did you do? But Preston. Preston had stopped listening, because a single terrible thought had begun to form. Someone had fed the Hawthorns, someone close. Someone who had lived inside these walls, watched everything, heard everything, and been so invisible that no one ever thought to watch her back. His wife. He started digging, frantically, hungrily, the way a cornered animal digs, and what he found undid him. That years ago, before any of it, a quiet university boy named Reed had loved a girl named Camille, the same girl her mother had sold to him, the same girl who slept in his house. The Hawthorne heir's lost love had been living under his roof the entire time. You, he breathed in an empty room, and then louder to the walls. You, and Preston Sterling went looking for his wife, with murder in his eyes. But Camille was already gone. She had felt it turning, the way she had always learned to feel the storms in that house. And before the worst of it broke, she had slipped out the door for the last time. By the time Preston tore through every room screaming her name, she was already far beyond his reach. The Hawthorns had seen to that. They had placed her somewhere no Sterling hand could ever follow, a private, guarded sanctuary, watched on every road in, the kind of protection only a family like theirs could provide, and they had made sure she was not alone. They gave us a place to stay, Camille says, and for the first time in this whole story, there is the ghost of a smile in her voice, somewhere safe, somewhere he could never reach, and Nia was right there with me. My best friend, the one who never once stopped fighting for me. I remember her looking at me one night and just saying, "You did it. You actually did it. After everything they took from you, you're the one still standing." And we cried, but not the way I used to cry. This time, it was different. While Camille was finally safe, the man who could not reach her turned, in his fury, on the one other person who could feel his world ending. Her mother. Preston went to Gloria Brooks like a hurricane. He didn't sit. He didn't lower his voice. "That daughter of yours," he spat. "The one you swore was a good little asset. She's been gutting me from the inside for months, feeding everything to the Hawthorns. And you didn't think to mention that the girl you sold me was the Hawthorne heir's woman?" Gloria went white. That's not possible. There is no way my daughter is connected to a family like the Hawthorns. I raised that girl. I would know. You don't get it. Preston's voice dropped to something venomous. "We are all going down. Your precious company, your name, all of it, right alongside mine. So you are going to fix this. You and that traitor daughter of yours caused it. And I promise you, Gloria, I will make her pay for every cent of it." And then he was gone. And Gloria stood alone in her beautiful, expensive house and did the thing that tells you everything about who she truly was. She did not call her daughter to warn her. She did not weep for the danger her child was in. With shaking hands, she opened her laptop and she searched the Hawthorne family, the only son, the heir, and a face filled her screen, a face she knew. A face she had stood over in her own marble foyer years ago and looked up and down with contempt. The boy with the broken car, the hazel-eyed nobody in the gray sweatshirt, the one she had called a charity case to his face and thrown out of her house, Elias. The breath went out of her. Her legs would not hold her, and she sank down onto the floor of her own home. But here is the cruelty of Gloria Brooks. Even then, even sitting on the floor with her empire collapsing around her, her first thought was not "my daughter is in danger." Her first thought was what I could have had. She told me once, much later, what went through her mind in that moment. Camille says, and her voice goes flat and cold. Not fear for me, not regret for what she'd done to me. No, she sat on that floor, and she mourned the connection. She thought about the parties she could have been invited to, the power she could have married into. She'd had a Hawthorne, an actual Hawthorne, in the palm of her hand, and she threw him into the street because his shoes were wrong. That was the thing that broke her. Not what she did to me, what she lost. Gloria Brooks hated herself that day, but never for the right reasons. Never once for the right reasons. And while she sat on her floor, drowning in everything she could have had, the final hammer fell. Elias released it all. Not a tease this time. Everything. His people had pulled the entire buried night up out of the dark. How the young woman truly died, the men Preston had paid to make her vanish, the fortune the Sterlings had spent to sell the world a lie, and they placed it at last into the hands of the one family that deserved it most. Hers. The young woman had a family of their own, powerful in their own right, though never Hawthorne powerful, who had spent years grieving a daughter they'd been told had simply run off and lost herself. And now they learned the truth. She had not run. She had been taken from them. And the man who did it had hidden behind one of the richest names in the country, while they buried an empty story instead of their child. When that broke, there was no slow bleed anymore. There was only collapse. No company on earth will tie itself to a confirmed killer. The allies who had been cautiously stepping back now ran for their lives. The board, already crowded with quiet faces, loyal to interests no one could name, voted Richard Sterling out of his own company before the week was through. And then came the morning Camille had waited 1,000 sleepless nights to see, though she was not there, and she has always been grateful for that mercy. Preston Sterling, the heir, the chief executive, the man who had taught her to gauge his moods by the sound of his keys against the marble, was led out of his own mansion in handcuffs, not only for the woman in that video, but for what he had set out to do to his own wife. The truth he was so certain he had erased had been waiting in the dark the entire time, like a held breath, and it finally got to exhale. He was tried, he was convicted, and every consequence he had been shielded from his entire protected life arrived all at once, with interest. People expected me to feel triumphant, Camille says quietly. I didn't. What I felt was smaller, and so much heavier. I thought about 2 children I never got to hold, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry for them, without being afraid of the sound. The man who had once controlled every single room she ever stood in, now controlled nothing at all. The properties went, then the shares. The Sterling name was peeled off building after building across the city, and the Hawthorne Fund that had owned them all along slid silently into its place, from everything to nothing, exactly as Elias had promised, not one dramatic blast, 1,000 quiet, lawful cuts. But there was one last reckoning, and it was the only one Camille never had to lift a finger for. Remember the exact shape of the deal. The Sterlings had not simply written Gloria Brooks a check. They had folded Brooks Development Group into the Sterling Empire as the price of the rescue. With her own 2 hands, Gloria had chained her life's work to that family's fate. So when the Sterling Empire went down, it dragged Brooks Development into the wreckage with it, every building with her name on it. The entire skyline she had spent 30 years climbing, gone, not because she built it poorly, but because she lashed it to a sinking ship, to avoid a young man she had decided was beneath her daughter. She sold her only child to save her company, and in the end, she lost both. And she had no one left to blame but the woman in the mirror. The last times the 2 of them stood face to face, in that whole bitter season, it was in the marble lobby of a tower that no longer carried the Brooks name. Gloria was alone. She stood staring at the pale rectangle on the wall, where her name used to hang, the ghost of it still there, in the unfaded stone, brighter than everything around it, because for 30 years the light had never touched it. She turned and saw her daughter standing in the doorway, and for a long moment, neither of them found a single word.
You did this.
You did this,
You destroyed
Gloria said
your
at
own
last.
mother.
And even now, ruined,
I
stripped
only
of
saved
everything, there was
myself.
accusation in it. Not apology, never apology. You and that Hawthorne boy, you destroyed your own mother. After everything I sacrificed for you. Camille didn't flinch. She had imagined this moment for 3 years, and now that it was finally here, she felt no urge to shout. Everything you sacrificed for me? Camille said. Her voice was shaking, but it was steady enough. Mama, you sacrificed me. You sold your daughter to a man you knew was cruel. You sent me back to him. When I came to you bleeding and grieving my children, you told me it was my fault, that I should fix my character and make him happy. You called me selfish for not wanting to die quietly in a mansion. She took a breath. I just stopped being the one who paid for your choices. Gloria's mouth opened and then closed. For the first time in Camille's entire life, her mother had no hook, no threat, no blade to slide quietly between her daughter's ribs. I gave you a life, Gloria whispered, most girls would beg for. No, Camille shook her head slowly. You gave me a price tag. You told me it was better to cry rich than to cry poor. She held her mother's eyes. Well, Mama, you finally lost everything over somebody's selfishness. You just got the somebody wrong. And there it was. The thing Camille would only fully understand much later. That even in that lobby, even in total ruin, her mother was not grieving what she'd done to her daughter. She was grieving the Hawthorne she'd thrown away, the fortune that slipped through her fingers, sitting in the wreckage of 2 lives, and still only counting the one cost that had ever mattered to her, money. Camille let the silence sit between them, the very same silence she had once let do its cruel work on a phone call years before. Except this time, she was not the one breaking. People ask me if I wanted her to suffer, Camille says now. And the truth is, I didn't have to want it. She built the trap, she baited it, and she walked into it all on her own. The only revenge I ever really took against my mother was that I finally stopped throwing myself in front of the consequences to save her. I stopped catching her. That was all it took. Camille turned, and she walked out of that lobby, into the daylight, and she did not look back. Behind her, Gloria Brooks stood alone, in a building full of echoes. Finally, perfectly, poor, not only in money, though that too, but in the one currency that had ever actually mattered. The one she had spent her entire life, refusing to believe was even real. The love of the daughter she threw away. Here is the part Gloria Brooks could never have written, no matter how carefully she had tried to author her daughter's life. The boy she discarded as a charity case, the one with the broken car, and the simple, worn clothes, and the part-time job behind a hardware counter was not merely a Hawthorne, and the Hawthornes were not merely billionaires. They held one of the largest private fortunes on the planet, the kind of wealth no longer measured in millions or even billions, the kind that shapes the world, from rooms most people never learn exist. Gloria had spent her daughter's whole childhood preaching that Camille must marry up. She never knew that the boy she threw out of her foyer could have bought everything she ever dreamed of, and never once noticed the cost. Camille and Elias married a year later. No 300 guests this time, no cameras, no row of satisfied investors watching a deal close. Just the two of them, and the few people who had truly earned a place there. And the home he built for her. He could have built her anything. A tower with her name across the top, a palace the whole world would envy. Instead, he built exactly what he had promised her, all those years ago, the one he made while playing the part of a boy with nothing. A home of their own, quiet and private, set on a green hill away from the noise of the world. Beautiful beyond anything she had ever known, soft stone and warm wood and walls of glass, gardens and light and space, a luxury estate built not to impress anyone, but to hold one woman safely for the rest of her life. And yes, there is a window in every single room, so that she would never again have to sit in the dark. She kept her own name, Camille Brooks. I wore another family's name like a collar for 3 years, she says. I was never going to borrow one again, just to feel like somebody. I am somebody, I always was. I just had to survive long enough to remember it. Nia stood beside her as maid of honor, exactly where she belonged, the friend who refused to let her drown, watching her finally learn to breathe on her own. And then Camille did something, entirely for herself. Her mother had built an empire of real estate, towers and buildings and a name stamped across a skyline. And for 30 years, she had wanted Camille to be part of it, an asset, an extension of the Brooks name. So Camille chose something else, something that was hers, and only hers. She opened her own design firm, small and entirely her own, built from the studs up, the honest way, her name on the door because she earned it, not because anyone purchased it for her, not as her mother's daughter, not as a Hawthorne's wife. Just as Camille, healing did not come quickly, and she has never pretended otherwise. There were nights the grief still found her, nights she still wept, for the children she lost in that house. But slowly, in a home full of windows, beside a man who had only ever wanted her, she learned to live again. I made them all pay, she says, without a trace of apology. The husband who treated me like property, the family that bought me to babysit their cruelty, and my mother, who started it all in that living room the day she told me my life was for sale. I carried their guilt for years. I finally handed it back. People ask Camille, when they hear how this ended, whether she has forgiven her mother. Her answer is simple, and she gives it without bitterness, which somehow makes it land harder. No, she says, and I've made my peace with that. Forgiveness is something you offer a person who's sorry. My mother was never sorry. Right up to the end, she thought the tragedy was that she lost the company, not that she sold her child, not that she sent me back to a man who took my babies from me. You can't forgive someone who still believes you were the crime. Gloria Brooks lost it all. The company, the name, the skyline. The respect she'd clawed for her whole life, she ended, exactly where she'd spent her whole life terrified of ending. With nothing. And she was beaten, not by bad luck or a clever enemy, but by the one belief she lived by, that a person is worth only what they can pay. She didn't underestimate Elias because he hid his fortune, Camille says. People assume that. It's not the truth. She underestimated him because she truly believed a man with empty pockets was a man with no value. That belief built her empire, and that exact same belief is what buried it. Sit with the shape of it. Had Gloria simply let her daughter love the so-called poor boy, had she even once valued Camille's life over her own greed, she would have kept her child, saved her company, and gained a son richer than her wildest imagining. Everything she ever wanted stood right there in her own foyer, and she threw it into the street because it didn't arrive in an expensive enough coat. And here is the cruelest part. Her greed didn't just cost her money. It cost 2 grandchildren she never knew, and a daughter she will never get back. So here is the question worth carrying out of this story. The one Camille turns over by her window on the quiet mornings. Have you ever watched someone destroy the most precious thing in their life simply because it didn't come with a price tag attached? Have you known a person so obsessed with looking rich that they threw away the very thing that could have made them rich in every way that counts? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one of them. And something tells us a great many of you are carrying a story of your own that deserves to be heard. Because Camille's story was never really about money at all. It was about the difference between what a thing costs and what a thing is worth. And the people who tear their own lives apart because they never learned to tell the two apart. Here at NovaDiary, we bring you a brand new story every single week. Stories of love and betrayal, of justice long delayed and finally delivered, and of the people who underestimate exactly the wrong person at exactly the wrong moment. If this one moved you, do us a small kindness before you go. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Leave a comment and tell us, honestly, what you would have done standing in Camille's shoes. Give this video a like and share it with someone who needs the reminder that the quiet ones are never the weak ones, and turn on that notification bell so the next story finds you the moment it lands. This has been the story of Camille, the woman they treated like currency, who turned out to be the most dangerous person in the room. We'll see you in the next one.